From MicrobeTV, this is TWiN, This Week in Neuroscience, episode number 68, recorded on January 12th, 2026. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about the nervous system. Joining me today from New York, Tim Chung.
Hello. Hi, Vincent. Hi, Vivian. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Yeah.
From New Orleans, Vivian Morrison. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. And Mardi Gras season has begun. So
Oh.
Really? I thought it was February.
it is, but we celebrate for a month. We eat cake for a month ahead of time, and there are parades that happen even before the actual date of Mardi Gras.
So as soon as Christmas is done, is Mardi Gras preparation.
Yeah.
Wow.
Gosh.
So to just never stop eating
Yep, pretty much.
from Thanksgiving on.
Yeah. It's a wonder there's not more obesity here. There's already quite a bit, but I hear.
Today's paper, I'm going to paraphrase. If you ever were thinking something and you didn't want someone else to hear it, now all that's off the table, apparently.
Yeah, I was like, this is super dangerous. This is going to be so
So Tim,
bad.
is that like a good way to look at this?
It is. So quite interestingly, the paper we're going to talk about today is about how to decode. It's for people who has difficulty speaking. So here we're talking about people with ALS, or in UK we call it motor neuron disease. So patients with this neurodegenerative disease, their motor neurons degrade, they die, and as the disease gets worse and worse, they really lose a lot of motor function. Yeah, and speaking is a big one. So the idea is maybe we can implant electrodes in the brain that can help you speak again, because of course, anyone who's looked at any videos online, half of them are now AI speech generated. It's not even a real person talking anymore. So the speech part is like getting really good, but the idea is if we can somehow decode what the person is trying to say with ALS.
You know what's weird about that, Tim? There are a lot of AI videos. They don't even bother to check them. I saw one.
Oh, and it just says something wrong.
So they'll say the word isn't, and the AI will go isn't and pronounce the T separately, right? Because that's the way it's written. Why don't they check it? This is all about making as much money as possible with as little effort.
Well, it's the little effort part. That's why they don't check it.
I was watching one, which I thought was Richard Feynman, and it's an AI voice of his. They're saying things he might have said, but didn't actually say. So why do I want to listen to this?
That's terrible.
Yeah, it's gonna, and it would just only get, it may or may not get worse, but that's just the reality we live in now, is that the technology is so good that you can pretty much generate whatever to really quite good fidelity. So sometimes not as good, but I mean, that's what happens when you try to scale things, I guess. But
that's why our podcasts are so quaint, because they're done by actual humans and we make mistakes.
Yeah. So we not only that, we make mistake for better or for worse, but we also, there's a lot of, when you have a human in the loop, there's a lot of human idiosyncrasy that might be actually quite nice. Like, how do we pick the paper is because, what we're thinking about on that day when our name comes up in the roster. And that kind of stuff is, I don't know, like if it's an AI generated, would they be as interesting as what, I don't know, maybe it's even more interesting. I don't know. But yeah, it's part of being human that who knows, maybe, because with Notebook LM, I do use Notebook LM, which is a kind of a podcaster. You can shove anything in, it will spit it back out. And it has its value as well. So anyway, let's get back to the topic that we're going to discuss, because Vivian's got to go in 1 hour bang on sharp. So let me not lose my sense of timing. So the paper we're going to discuss today is published in Cell, and it's published earlier last year in August 2025. And it's by, the first author is Erin Kunz, and the last, and she's also the corresponding author, so I don't know whether but I'll say the senior author is Francis Willett, who is also the last author. And then there's many people in the middle that too many to mention, but these researchers it's a collaboration between Stanford University, Georgia Tech, Emory University and Georgia Tech, UC Davis, Brown, and I think Harvard. So a kind of like across the country collaboration. And like I mentioned earlier, it really is focusing on how to help patients with motor neuron disease, ALS, to be able to speak. So one of the, I think, especially if you're in UK, the most famous, and probably across the world too, the most famous person with ALS is probably Stephen Hawking.
Was.
Sorry?
Was.
Yeah, exactly, was. And if you have seen any video with Stephen Hawking, you know that, first of all, he can't actually speak. He speaks famously, speaks through like a computerized text that has a very old school computer voice. And I had to look this up. He actually controls what he speaks to the computer by using his facial muscles. So he's still retained, you can tell because by just his video, his interviews, like he can look at you. So his eye muscles are working great. And he can use his cheek muscle to type in stuff to the computer. He can crack a joke that the computer slowly says, and then he will just look at you and smile. So his cheek muscle works very well, and that's how I believe that's how he controls the computer for speech and also movement of his wheelchair. But technology has advanced. So nowadays, researchers are thinking about, of course, if you're using your cheek to control a computer, it's very, very slow. So that's why it takes him a while to set up the joke, and he kind of grins at you, and then you wait for the joke and the punchline to come. Maybe there's now a way to, with help of brain-computer interface, BCI, so these are technology that are increasingly more and more realistic because we have better recording devices with electrodes that can go into the brain and computing power that can kind of try to decode what is going on. So in this paper, the goal is to plug an electrode into the ALS patient's motor cortex. So motor cortex is the bit of the brain that controls your movement. So they send axons down to your spine, to the motor neurons down to the spine, and the motor neurons down your spine talk to your muscles. And the motor cortex so in the spine, you have what is known as the lower motor neurons. And in the brain, in the motor cortex in the brain, you have what is known as the upper motor neurons that talks to the lower motor neurons in the spine. And in ALS, actually, both degenerate. So it's something to watch out for, which is the researchers are putting in electrodes in the bit of the brain that potentially will degenerate as the disease progresses. But despite this potential worry, they realize that they can actually still use the motor cortex to decode a lot of interesting stuff. So, so let's just talk about the experiment now. They implanted, and these patients actually, they had electrodes implanted before because they were part of previous experiments as well. But the electrodes are implanted in the motor cortex in bits of the area that is quite close to the classical area people think produces speech, which is this thing called Broca's area. So in Broca's area is a bit of the brain that kind of like maybe 100 years ago, people realized if you have damage in this brain, you really suffer in terms of producing speech. And so one of the famous patients with damage in this brain, all he could say was tan, 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 tan. So whenever he says anything, he just goes tan, 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 tan. And obviously that is really hard for anyone to understand.
And it's on one side, right? It's not like both sides. right? Broca's
I
area.
think Broca's area is on the left side, but don't quote me on this. I didn't look it up.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
But this paper, they implanted, I believe, all the patients on the left side. I need to double check. I think. Let's say it is, but it's a detail. It's a detail. But they implanted the electrodes close to the Broca's area, but not exactly there. Because in a previous paper, they actually found Broca's area didn't do a very good job of decoding anything. So there's like an increasing evidence that maybe it's not Broca's area. Maybe it's the region around it. But they implanted the electrodes in this place called the superior and the inferior frontal sulcus part of the motor cortex. That has been evidence that it is involved in speech production. So their idea is to ask two questions. One is, can you use the neuroactivity in these brain region to guess what the subject is trying to say, and then turn it into using a computer text-to-speech kind of generator to say it for the subject. So they actually they asked the subjects they gave subjects basically one of 7 words, and they asked the subjects to, they have several conditions. The first conditions, which is the one that is probably most effortful for people with ALS, is they ask the subjects to actually attempt to speak it. So, for example, they would have the word kite on the screen, and there will be a bit of a delay, and then there will be a go signal. So a blinker comes on, and the subject would try to say the word kite. But since the subjects have ALS, these subjects are known as dysarthric, which is the technical term for being having difficulties to speak. So these subjects, there are some videos you can watch. They would, instead of saying kite, they would just be able to. The best they can do is to kind of grunt the word out, because the facial muscle in the tongue is so impaired.
What did you say was dysarthric?
Yeah, they call it. I actually should have looked it up. It's dysarthric.
Yeah, and that's like
Dysarthr.
in contrast to like aphasia or something like that, which I think involves more like finding the word, kind of more like cognitive and less like the performance of speech, but more the kind of upstream cognitive stuff that is also impacted in people who have strokes.
Exactly. So aphasia, what you see when that happens is patients would still say words, but they're sometimes, at least in the textbook, they say it's kind of like word salad. So they would say words that don't really make much sense when strung together, but they can still kind of enunciate things that sounds like words. But dysarthric, I think, is you can, for example, the patients can read and they would understand language. They just can't really produce it.
Yeah, I guess my point is that with the individuals who have aphasia, they also have they might have so these patients with ALS, who it's like everything progresses normally until we get to the actual production. They have normal cognition. They haven't lost anything that's associated with like thinking about language or speech.
Look at Stephen Hawking.
Yeah, exactly. And then, but with people who have aphasia, I wonder to what extent this kind of BCI could also be useful for them, because like if it's that, and I can't remember, but there is some part of the like chain of events that has to happen that is interrupted, but I don't think it's as early on. It's so early on that like the person's cognition is just like non-functional, because many of these people function normally. They just can't like produce the speech. So, and the reason I bring this, or one of the reasons I'm thinking about this, is because like ALS, it doesn't like, do you know what percentage of the population it affects? Like, no idea. I don't think it's like,
it's not high.
It's actually not that high, but stroke, for example, which I think can also impact the actual like production of speech, as we see people who have like sagging, or one half of their face is sagging or contracted. But that this technology could actually help an even larger slice of the population, those people who have suffered strokes.
Yeah, in
1 in 400 develop
for ALS.
0.25%.
Yeah. And in fact, in this paper, they do this brain-computer interface technology in 4 subjects, 4 patients, and only 3 of them have ALS. Only 3 of them have ALS. One of them actually have stroke in the pons area, so like close to the brainstem. That really affects a lot of the motor function, including speech. So that is exactly what you're saying, is that it helps more than, as long as the language comprehension and maybe kind of production upstream of motor neurons is intact.
Maybe.
Yeah, generation. Yeah, exactly. But for like aphasia, that I really don't know enough to comment whether there are people, like whether they can be.
I think there are different kinds, different stages. So
yeah.
But anyway.
Anyway, so yes. So for these patients, the experimenter asked them to. The first condition is that the patients would attempt to actually say the words, and then the experimenters recorded their neuroactivity in the motor cortex, in the speech motor cortex, let's say. And the second condition, in the same patients, the experimenter asked them, don't say it, so don't verbalize, and don't even move your face or your lips. Like you don't move any muscles to make the sound. Just think about it. So this is what they call auditory inner speech, where you just basically think about the sound of the word almost. There's also another condition that they ask the patient to do, which is motoric inner speech. So this is slightly different. This is, you would still think of the word kite, and you think about how to say it, but you don't move any of your muscles. So there are slight different conditions of inner speech that you can try to get the subject to do. But the commonality of this inner speech is that the subjects don't move any muscles. So if you were to do like EMG, where you record the electrical activity, they would not be moving, as opposed to attempted speech, where they are trying to make the sound. And finally, the last condition is what they call a passive condition. They're not even trying to produce the word. They are either just listening to someone else say the word kite, or one of the 7 words that they are using, or the subject is silently reading the word on the screen. So these different conditions, the experimenter thinks, gives them a wide enough array to try to dissect how the brain is working under these different conditions. So the first thing they did was they kind of measured the electrical activity of all these different electric array. So for each patient, they have several of these arrays, and these are electrodes that come in a grid, and each array has 64 channels. That is 64 little spikes that are basically electrodes that can go into the brain, and each spike would be able to detect actually multiple neurons at a time. And what the researchers did was that they just measured basically around the time when the subject is either looking at trying to produce the word, like during the go signal, or passively listening to the word. Around this time window, there's a little bit of fiddliness to try to figure out which is the best time window. You can basically look at, for each of the channel, how much electrical activity is going on, how many times that those neurons around that channel spikes. And the idea is that if you record enough neurons in enough channels, then different words would trigger a different pattern of spiking. And you can use that pattern as a way of training an algorithm to separate those words. So you basically, since you know what word the subject's trying to say, because you showed it to the subject, you basically ask the algorithms algorithm to say, okay, during these trials, the subject was trying to say the word kite. During these other trials, the subject is trying to say the word day. And so the 7 words that the experimenter chose are all monosyllabic, so the duration is similar. And they kind of cover a range of what is known as phonemes, which is basically kind of like the syllables that we say. Like if you go to a dictionary, they break down a word into the phonemes, like, ba, pa, or a, that kind of stuff, like break a word down into how you pronounce it. So they try to cover as much as possible. And once they train this algorithm, they basically probe the algorithm, probe this decoder and ask it, how good are you at telling apart these 7 words for each of the condition? Remember, we have several conditions. One is the subject is actually attempting to say the word. And the other condition is the subject is producing inner speech. So they are just thinking about saying the word without actually saying it. And the last one is what is known as passive conditions, where the subject is either listening to the word or just reading the word. And if you look at the neural recording traces, by far the condition that has the most, that elicits the most firing is when the subject is actually trying to vocalize during attempted vocalized speech. You see the most kind of neurons changing the firing rate. Whereas during the inner speech, the neuron firing, they still change, but it's much more subtle. So kind of by eye, it looks like it's not doing very much. But the decoder was able to pick up on differences. So they presented how well the decoder is able to discriminate between these 7 words for each of the condition. And for a particular array in area I6V, which is inferior 6 ventral or something, it's one of the region in the motor cortex, they are getting accuracy of between 60 to 90%. So pretty good accuracy of decoding these words. Although chance level is, 100 divided by 7. So, it's above chance, let's say.
But it's just a few words. It's just 7 words or something.
Exactly. It's like just seven words.
Do you think it's possible to, like a good vocabulary, they say is 125,000 words. Could you do that one day?
We will get there.
Ah, okay.
We will get there, but you got to ask. So by far, the best performance is when the subjects are attempting to make the speech. The decoder works upwards of like between 80 to 100%, 99%. Well,
but during the waves, the electrical waves produced when you try, say, if your word kite, they're going to be the same between trying and imagining it, right?
That we will also get to.
Okay.
That is a very good question. That is actually figure 2. But that is exactly, we can actually transition to the next figure. But just before we go there, the best decoding performance is when the subject is trying to say it, because there's so much modulation of the neural signal that it allows any decoder a lot of, the decoder can separate things really well because the signal is so huge. During inner speech, the modulation is smaller. It looks like, at least by eye, the changes in firing is a bit smaller. So the decoding performance goes down to like, instead of like upwards of 80%, it's like maybe 50 to 70%. So that is something to pay attention to. But the researchers, there's communication with the subjects, of course. And the subjects all say that it would be wonderful to have something that can decode words I'm trying to say without me verbalizing it, because if you look at these videos of the subjects verbalizing it, they make sounds and grunting noises that is not as natural as they would like. So, and also it's very effortful. Like if you have ALS and you're trying to move, it's also very effortful. So it's much more naturalistic if the researchers can try to decode just inner speech, so to say. So that's why the researchers went ahead and ask exactly the question that Vincent was asking. Is there any similarity between inner speech and attempted speech for if you look at the 7 words, if you just look at the word kite, is there, when the subject is saying it versus when the subject is just thinking the inner speech version of kite, does it look the same? So we are going to dip our toes into something that I'm a little bit scared of, which is me trying to explain how researchers actually, neuroscientists think about things like this. And what people do is, I'm going to say the technique that people use, and then I'll try to explain it a little bit. And then if anything is unclear, please ask me, and I'll try my best to explain it. Because I think one of the reasons that we talk about these papers is not only because they're interesting and they are kind of cutting edge research, but it would be nice if there are some fundamental principles in there that neuroscientists use a lot that we can dig a little bit deeper into and learn something in it. So today we're going to talk about how neuronal firing is represented when we analyze it, and how when we try to think about it, how we do dimension reduction and how we represent it spatially. And we're going to talk about interesting things like orthogonal subspace. So wish me luck. So what the researchers, so the question is this, the researchers want to know the neural pattern when the subjects are making in the motor cortex, when they're trying to say the word kite, so attempted speech and vocalizing, versus when they're just thinking about the word kite, so the inner speech. Does the neural firing look similar? So what you do is basically do a correlation. And how that works is this. So let's picture the very, very simple case that you are just recording from 2 neurons. So instead of like 64 electrodes, all you have just two neurons. So it's very, very simple. Now, what you can do, what researchers do, is they plot the 2 neurons firing basically on an XY axis. So x-axis would be neuron 1's firing, and the y-axis would be neuron 2's firing. And so let's say, for example, when you say the word kite, only neuron 1 fire and neuron 2 doesn't fire. Whereas if you say the word day, which is one of the 7 words, then neuron 2 fires and neuron 1 doesn't fire. Then what happens is when you say the word kite and neuron 1 fires, you would put a point on very far to the right on the x-axis. So let's say you can represent the 2 neurons as if it is basically a plane, a surface, let's say on your table. So let's say your table is what researchers would plot to represent these neuronal firing. And your left-right axis is how much neuron 1 fires, okay? And your near and far axis on this table is how much neuron 2 fires. So if during kite, neuron 1 fires a lot, you would have a point all the way to the right. Whereas if during the word day, neuron 2 fires a lot, you'll have a point all the way really far into the table, okay? So with these 7 words, you have a bunch of points that are scattered on these tables. And the idea is if the words elicit very different types of neuronal firing, these points would cluster. You would have these 7 different clusters of words. And you can ask the question, for every single word that we say, does the cluster, for example, say for kite, does that cluster, is it similar for attempted speech and also for inner speech? And the way you do it is basically for every trial that you say the word kite, you look at where the points lie on the table and you draw an arrow from the origin to that kite point for attempted speech, and then you draw also the arrow for inner speech. And you just ask the question, do those arrows point in the same direction? If they point in the same direction, then the neural pattern is similar. Whereas if they point, interestingly, if they point in the exact opposite direction, then the neural pattern is opposite. It is still similar, but it is similar in the opposite way. And then a third potential condition is that in attempted speech, your arrow is pointing to the right, but in inner speech, your arrow is pointing up. So they're at 90 degrees of each other, in which case they are said to be not correlated at all with each other because the you can go left, right without ever interfering with up, down. They're at 90 degrees of each other. And similarly, if you think about what that means is maybe when I'm attempting to say the word kite, my neuron 1 is firing a lot. Whereas if I'm thinking about the word kite, so for inner speech, only my neuron 2 fires and neuron 1 doesn't fire. In which case, the neural representation is completely different. They are non-correlated. I hope, does that make any sense? So think of it as basically the correlation is just for every single word, you look at the arrows pointing on my table, on my neuronal representational table, and which direction the arrow is pointing at, and then just average out the similarity of these arrows over all the words. So what you can do is look at the arrow for each of the words for attempted speech versus inner speech. And you can ask, do the arrows look similar? And what they found is, yes, it actually looks fairly similar. So the correlation, they say the correlation matrix, but really just is a collection of these arrows plotted in a grid. The pattern of these arrows look very similar for attempted versus inner speech. So that tells you that your neural representation, your brain, the way the brain fires for attempted speech and inner speech, at least in the motor cortex, is actually somewhat similar, which is interesting because you would think whenever the motor cortex fires, you should trigger some sort of movement. But during inner speech, there's actually very little movement going on. So that actually brings to the second part of this long diatribe on neuronal representation, which is what the researchers did next is they want to dig a little bit deeper into what is going on, how to analyze these patterns of firing in the brain when different kind of for attempted versus inner speech. So what they did was they basically did a PCA of all these. So they have PCA, which stands for Principal Component Analysis. And this is a technique that researchers use to reduce, quote unquote, reduce the dimension of whatever you're looking at to something more manageable so we can plot it on a 2D sheet of paper. So that probably didn't mean anything for anyone. So I'm going to try to explain it a little bit. So what is dimension reduction and why is it very useful? So remember earlier I said you can imagine you have two different neurons in the brain firing, neuron 1 and neuron 2, right? So if the neurons 1 and 2 are firing independently of each other, so neuron A can fire regardless of how neuron 1 can fire regardless of how neuron 2 fires, then and every time the neuron fire, you plot like a point on the table telling you how fast the neurons are firing. If the two neurons fire independently from each other, then all the points tracking how much they fire would cover the whole table because they can fire however they like without interfering with each other. But when you look inside the brain, and the same goes on, the same applies if you have three neurons. So consider the case where you have three neurons. You would plot the firing of the first neuron on the x-axis, so the left-right axis of the table. The second neuron would be the near and far axis. And now you have three neurons. You've got to expand your mind a little bit and go from just the flat surface of a table to like a box. So imagine the table. You don't just consider the table, but the entire volume. And the third axis, the z-axis, would be the third neuron, how much the third neuron is firing. Now, if the three neurons are firing independently of each other, then every time you plot how much the neurons are firing, it would fill the entire volume of this box. But in the brain, when we actually put in electrodes and observe what is going on, it turns out neurons don't fire independently. They fire in a quite correlated way. So what that means is, for example, neuron 1 and 2 might fire exactly, so this is as a toy example, neuron 1 and 2 might fire exactly the same as each other. And if that is true, if you observe that, then when you plot on the little flat table of how the neurons are firing, all the points lie on the single line at 45 degrees, because they are always they are one-to-one correlated with each other. So you don't span the entire table. You are just like on this line. So what that means is, if you are trying to analyze what's going on, you don't have to consider the entire table. You can rotate your little chair that you're sitting on 45 degrees and then just look at this single line, and you have all the information you need, and you don't lose any information. And similarly, you can have 3 neurons that fire in a very correlated way. So maybe neuron 1 and 2 can fire independently, so they span like the surface of a table. But neuron 3 firing matches exactly neuron 2's firing, in which case you would have, if you plot all the points of how much a neuron is firing, it would it would not be the whole box, it would just be a flat sheet on the box. It would just be a table tilted. So instead of thinking of 3D box, you can just consider the table, and you can look at you can tilt your chair so that you look at the table kind of head on, face on, and you have all the information you need. So that is how you do dimension reduction. Is PCA, basically principal component analysis, is just a nifty way of, if I give you all these high dimensional data, let's say you have 100 neurons, can I move my chair around in this 100 dimensional space so that I can basically get rid of some of the dimensions, because they are correlated with the neurons are correlated with each other, and really you only have, say, 40 neurons that are firing independently, effectively. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
I hope that makes some sense. Mm-hmm. Okay. Wow. So if anyone's been listening, well done. So we covered dimension reduction, which is just a way for researchers to rotate the chair to make the neurons, all these neurons, down to a slightly more manageable way so that we can think about it. Now, having set up all these things, we're going to ask the question, how can we plan what we're going to do? How can we basically think about movement without actually moving? So the difference between inner speech and attempted speech really is, in attempted speech, you're actually moving, whereas in inner speech, you're just thinking about it. So this is somewhat analogous. It's not exactly the same, but it's kind of analogous to the case when you're planning to move versus the case where you're actually moving. And I'm actually going to step a little bit out. I know we're running short of time, but it's worth, I don't know whether it's worth it, but it's kind of fun to think about it. There's a paper quite a while ago from Krishna Shenoy's lab, which is quite a classic paper that even I've heard of it, where they looked at, they looked at monkeys when they are planning to move versus when they're actually moving. And they asked the question, what does it look like in the brain? Because when you're planning to move, your muscles aren't moving. But obviously, there's a lot of situation where you really want to plan what you're doing, like, whether in sports, whether you're shooting like a basketball or whatever, you want to think about what you're going to do ahead of time.
A goal unit thingy.
Sorry?
It just sounded the way you were like, you're going to, what is
this
something
thing
that they
you
do in
sports where you move. So what they did.
Getting up from the couch, I'm thinking about it, but I don't want to do it yet.
Exactly. So in this monkey paper, what they did was they asked a question. They trained monkeys basically they show the monkey on a screen, a little maze with a starting point and an end point. And the monkey has to drag this thing from the starting point all the way to the end point through the maze using the finger. So the monkey has to plan where it's going to do, at which point it earns like a little bit of juice. So the monkey has to plan how it wants to go from start to end through this maze. So you would expect, basically, if you measure the muscles, during the planning phase, the monkey is not moving at all. But if you record from the motor cortex, during this planning phase, the motor cortex going nuts. It's firing like crazy. And then when the monkey moves, the motor cortex again fires. But now there's muscle that is moving. So the question is, how come when I'm planning, so when I'm moving, it makes sense the motor cortex is firing, right? Because if you electrically stimulate the motor cortex, your muscle move. That's why it's called the motor cortex. It's the most sensitive to you stimulating and the muscle moving. But how come when I'm planning, my motor cortex also fires, but my muscle is completely not moving? So one potential hypothesis is that maybe something downstream is inhibiting my movement, just like when you're sleeping and you're dreaming, you don't act out your dreams. So that happens when you're dreaming, is that somewhere in the brainstem is inhibiting all your motor neurons from talking to your spine so that you don't actually move, except for your eyes, which goes crazy. But these researchers
so that
found
you don't
that
lose your vision because other parts there's some idea that the reason you dream or see things when you dream is to prevent neighboring regions of the brain from starting to invade the visual cortex. Anyway,
okay.
Different time, different story.
But these researchers found that actually doesn't explain in the monkey's case, when you're planning to move your forelimb, there's no obvious region that is inhibiting these neurons from going to the motor cortex. Potentially a different explanation is that maybe if you imagine, again, we're going back to dimension reduction now, that's the whole point. Let's say you have only just two neurons. In the monkey's case, neuron 1 and neuron 2. Maybe during actual movement, neuron 1 fires, but during planning, only neuron 2 fires. And neuron 2 is the designated planner. And somehow you do all your planning with neuron 2 firing, and then somehow neuron 2 talks to neuron 1, and then tells neuron 1 what to do, and then neuron 1 does its firing, and then moves the hand. But when the researchers measured the motor cortex, they found the cells that are modulated during planning are pretty much the same cells that are modulated during movement. So this separation between neuron 1 and 2 doesn't make any sense. It doesn't plan out. So what is going on? So what these researchers did was they measured all the cells that are moving, that are firing during movement, and then they did this principal component analysis, this PCA, rotating the chair, so that they dimensionally reduce it so that it is now, instead of having very, very many neurons firing, filling this entire box, they kind of reduced it to a single line. Just for the sake of argument, they reduce it down to a single line. So so in the case of, let's say, if you have two neurons, you can imagine if when you move, whenever neuron 1 is firing, neuron 2 is firing exactly the same, then you can rotate it 45 degrees. In this case, what they found is once they rotate it 45 degrees and they look at what the neurons are doing when they're planning, the two neurons, 1 and 2, are also firing. They're not firing, they're modulating. But they fire in a way that exactly cancels each other out when you rotate the chair at 45 degrees. And what that means is that they are firing they're firing at 90 degrees relative to where you rotated the chair, like when you have dimensionally reduced it. And this is called the orthogonal subspace. Orthogonal just means at a 90 degrees. And what this means is you can, if your neurons are firing in this orthogonal subspace at 90 degrees, then it really doesn't interfere at all with your movement subspace, your movement potent space. So like what you've rotated your chair to align yourself to the way the neurons fire when you're moving. And what is actually going on is when you're planning, you move on this so-called orthogonal subspace. You move 90 degrees to where you actually are, to the way you move when you're actually moving. And then when you decide to move, there's a rotation back to your movement 45 degrees. So you go from minus 45 degrees to 45 degrees, if that makes any sense. So this is what the researchers are trying to do. They're basically, so that was a very long, very, very long attempt for me to try to explain these different subspaces, which is, once again, just to summarize, is you swivel your chair, you only look at trials when the patients or the monkeys, or the subjects are attempting to move, or are actually moving, you rotate the chair until you align with that dimension, and then you look at what happens when the subject is planning to move but not moving. Now, in the monkey forelimb case, so when a monkey is moving, they found when they rotate the chair so that they are aligned with what the neurons are doing when they're moving, they don't see any movement when the monkey is planning because it is orthogonal. It's become invisible. But in this case, in the inner speech case, in human, when they're attempting to speak, they even after they aligned it to the plane when you're actually moving, you actually still see when you're attempting to speak, when you're doing inner speech, so you're just thinking about speaking, you still see firing that looks just like the firing you see when you're actually speaking. So there's no there's the subspace of inner speech is not 100% independent. So it's instead is a miniature scaled down version. So earlier I was saying the firing rate seem a bit lower when they're undergoing inner speech. So even in this movement subspace, the firing is still preserved. And you can actually start looking at things like geometry. And imagine what we were talking about earlier. You can cluster the points of how the neurons firing on the table into like different clusters. Like when you say the word kite, maybe all the firing is to the right. When you say the word day, all the firing is to the top. You can look at how these clusters relate to each other. Like, for example, the word day might be always counterclockwise to kite. And if you see that, what you see is when the subject is doing inner speech, that kind of geometry is preserved. So everything is just a scaled down version of it. So this is some implication to how your brain actually processes things. So the conclusion of this bit of data is that when the researchers look at attempted speech, so when the patients are actually verbalizing, trying to verbalize, versus inner speech, just thinking about it, they see a very similar pattern of firing. But the inner speech is a shrunken version, kind of a slightly smaller version of the attempted speech version. So we can think about maybe what the brain is doing to stop you from actually verbalizing things out loud is they set a threshold. Your pattern has to exceed this threshold before you actually verbalize it. And that's why if you have a shrunken version, which is what the inner speech is, you have a shrunken version, you don't actually verbalize it. And that's what they proposed. Now, okay, we're going to move swiftly on because I've spent way too long explaining the one theoretical
So basically,
side.
You can hide things you're thinking about without it being decoded.
Right. If you have this, if it is in fact what the brain is doing is that they're setting a threshold, then as long as you never cross that threshold, then you won't say anything. What you're thinking out loud. And you can think about, maybe people with Tourette's, maybe they have a different threshold, things like that.
Interesting.
So those are things that we can, researchers can explore.
Hold on. Just the other thing I wanted to bring up or point out or put out there is that some people don't, there's some portion of the population that doesn't experience inner speech.
Right, they actually mentioned that.
Oh, they do? Yeah. So
right at the end, but still, this population of people, they still have the capacity to think. I mean, the question is
huge. Why do they experience it? Because you might find that like what you've just described exists in a person who experiences inner speech kind of like explicitly. They it's as if they're hearing themselves talk, and it is very like linked to language and production of language. You might see the same exact pattern in somebody who doesn't experience inner speech that way, which it's like, okay, so we are all thinking. Then that's another question as to why people experience it one way versus the other.
Yeah, it would be quite weird if like even people who don't experience inner speech, you can do this inner speech decoding.
Yeah.
Which just means they are not conscious of the inner speech that they are. I mean, that would be really freaky if they play back out to you and say, you're actually thinking about this.
Well, I mean, they even use language. They're like, I thought to myself, what could that, how can that possibly be meaningful if you, like the concept of thinking to yourself would feel foreign if you did. it's a different
Yeah.
topic, but I'd be interested to see kind of like if you had those two different people, would these neural representations and this correlation, and the idea of the threshold, be the same?
Yeah. It's like the role that language plays in thought is like hotly debated. They also mentioned, so it's like really interesting to think about it. As someone who's bilingual, because different languages have different ways of representing things. Like, does it actually affect things?
I'm going to have to go fairly soon, but I wanted to ask another question actually while I'm still here. So I looked at the words. It's ban, feel, day, choice, were, kite, and though, and day, choice, kite, those ban, well, I guess that could be a noun or a verb, that one. But then some of these other things are verbs, and then some don't really, I forget what they're called, but like though doesn't have like you don't like have an image of though in your head, And so I was wondering, do they talk at all about how the kind of the gain change that you see in inner speech of a word that doesn't have a strong like physical or visual representation, how that
they might have looked at it in a previous publication, because this is like a long line of research of trying to decode. I'm gonna just completely wild guess is that by the time you get to the motor cortex, maybe a lot of more of the semantic or grammatical meaning is no longer affecting the firing.
Yeah, that's a good
my
point.
guess, but I have no idea.
No, but that's
really
a good
no
point.
idea.
Yeah.
It might be like more quote unquote upstream. Anyway, so having shown that they can decode a 7-word task, the researchers scaled it up to first 50 words, and then 125,000 words. So this is quite a task. So we're going to talk about how they do it. So if you think about trying to separate 7 words on a table, you can probably do it. But if you want trying to separate 125,000 things on a table, you're going to need a really, really big table. So instead, so this is a much harder task. So the researchers wisely simplified it by breaking words down into phonemes. So phonemes, like we said before, is like the little sounds that you make as you say a word, like l, b, b. Like if it doesn't have a vowel, it would just be b, things like that. But you can also have vowels like u, e, that kind of stuff, which is in the dictionary. Now, as it turns out, the English language has approximately like 44 phonemes, and words are just combination of phonemes. So you immediately went from 125,000 word problem to a 44 thing problem. So it makes it much easier. So the researchers basically got these neural recording, shoved it to what is called a recurrent neural net. We won't go into the technicalities, but it's a neural net that can spit out, based on the neural recording, spit out which phoneme it thinks it's the most likely. And then these phonemes get output to a different language model that would string these phonemes together to find the most likely words and sentence that the subject might be trying to say or is thinking about. And so the researchers collected a ton of data. So they presented sentences for the subjects to speak, so they know the ground truth. So for training neural network, you need the ground truth. And in this case is they give words for the subjects to say, and then the subjects try to say it, and then they try to fit the decoder so that they maximize the correctness of the prediction to the ground truth. There's actually a little bit of subtlety because you don't know where the phonemes are getting segmented inside. They mention a little bit about this, but I won't go into the details because I frankly don't understand it. But they found after this training, they are able to get they first tried it on a 50-word vocabulary, and they got pretty good decoding performance for even just inner speech. So at least on paper, they say in the graph, they say they get maybe a 20% error rate. So 1 every 5 words is wrong. But actually 1 every 5 words, if I don't know how many words I've spoken during the last podcast, but like it would be almost incomprehensible if 1 every 5 words is wrong.
Yeah.
And when they scaled it up to 125,000 words, this kind of error rate went up to like between 30 to 50%. So it is still a work in progress. And so sadly, this paper is paywalled. It's in Cell. But if you are able to, but I'll send a link to Vincent for the draft version so that it's still, you can see the open draft version of this. But in Cell, there's a video of the patients trying to decode, trying to think about a sentence and then the decoder working. And it's kind of painful because they get it wrong quite a lot. Whereas in a previous paper, the same researchers decoded attempted speech. So the patients are trying to verbalize, and the verbalization is completely, it's unintelligible because they have lost so much motor function. But the decoder works really well. So there's still a huge gap between attempted and inner speech. But anyway, so it is a work in progress, but they're able to decode
Vivian
50%.
needs to go. Goodbye,
Yeah,
Vivian.
Tim,
Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you so much. And this, I know you felt bad about, or that you'd wasted time describing some of these fundamental things, but I think they're super interesting
I hope
and very
people find it
useful.
interesting.
Very useful. So I just wanted to say thank you, and then it was good to
Okay.
see all you guys and continue having a fruitful discussion. And I'll see you guys
Thank you, Vivian.
next time. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Vivian. Okay. Yes, I hope it was fruitful, whatever I was described.
Is there anything more? Because I wanted you to summarize that this. If you're done, I don't know if you are or not.
Almost, but I can quickly go through some of the kind of main signposts for the rest of the paper, which is they can basically have 50%. So when you're trying to decode word, the performance is still not super great, but
And we're talking about decoding things you're thinking only, not trying to vocalize, right?
not trying to vocalize, just what you're thinking about. But they can use the same decoder and they can basically design task that elicits inner thought, inner speech. For example, they have a task. So before all the task is the experimenter explicitly give you a word or a sentence and you think about it and then you say, and the computer says it back. But the researchers are wondering, what if we didn't give you any explicit instruction? Because a lot of our mental thinking is just uncued, right? If you ever just sat around in the shopping, waiting in line when you're doing shopping, you're not cued to think about the thoughts in your head, but it still exists. So the researchers gave them a task where they actually didn't explicitly cue them to think of words. They just presented arrows. So it will be arrows, like for example, up arrow, and then a right arrow, and then another up arrow. And then after a delay, the subjects will have to move a joystick because they still have a little bit of motor function. They have to move a joystick up, right, and up. They have to match the arrow. So the idea is that during the delay, you basically you translate the arrows into sound, into up, right, up. So this is a way of testing whether the decoder can decode your inner speech without explicitly the experiments are telling you to, and they are able to do it. So this is one task. Another task where they showed that you can decode inner speech is they gave the subjects a big grid composed of different shapes. So like some shapes will be circle, some shapes will be rectangular, and the shapes is either green or pink. And they would ask the subjects just count the pink rectangle. So basically it's a screen full of things that you're supposed to find with a lot of distractor. And most people's strategy is to literally, whenever you see something that you want to count, you just say to yourself, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just as, intuitively, that's how you count. And they basically train a decoder to see if they can pick up that. They train a decoder just to focus on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the number words. And they found if indeed that the subjects are using the words to count in the head, in a speech to count, they should be able to decode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in sequence. And that is exactly what they see. There's a lot of noise, indeed. So if you look at the actual raw data, it is not like 1 to 1. Every time you say it's the first position, they say 1. That is very noisy. But the trend is there that you can basically decode the numbers going up. So these tell you that the decoder can actually detect inner speech. They also ask the subjects to like think about autobiographical thoughts versus other thoughts, like, you know, clear versus other thing, like think about what's the capital of France, you know, things that requires vocal thought versus clear your mind. And they found that when they say clear your mind, they can't really decode any words. Well, they can, but they decode more words when the question requires them to think about sentences than things like clear your mind. So this all tells you that they can at least decode something resembling words in your head when you're thinking about words. But they also mentioned that every now and then, they would try to decode what the subject is thinking during these like decoding period and try to see if they can make out any sensible sentence. And what they found is that most of them just don't actually make any sense. And they don't know whether it's because the decoder isn't very good, which I think there's quite a lot of evidence is that decoder isn't very good, or whether our thought really is just quite unstructured. It's still unknown. But almost we're a couple more things before the end of the paper. The first is going back to before we're talking about the subspaces. They want to find out, do you remember earlier I said, if you swivel your chair so that you're aligned with the table that the neurons fire to when you're attempting to speak, what you find is that when you're just doing inner speech, you still see the same pattern, but it's scaled down. Mm-hmm. But then these researchers asked the question, well, how about in the orthogonal subspace, in the 90 degrees, is there any changes when you're attempting to speak versus when you're producing when you're attempting to speak versus when you're just thinking the inner speech? Is there any movement along this 90 degrees axis? Because if there is, there's still something there to be picked up. And that's exactly what they found, is that when they rotated the chair to align with the plane that the neuronal firing pattern aligns on when they are attempting to speak, when they swivel the chair, they see at the 90 degrees axis, when you're just doing inner speech, the inner speech pattern is actually shifted along this 90 degrees axis. So not only is it scaled down, it's also shifted. So that tells you there's actually the brain is looking quite different when you're attempting to speak versus when you are actually just having an inner speech. And very finally, we're coming to the end of the paper, is the privacy concern, which is, now we're not quite there yet, as they say, as we've discussed, like the inner speech decoding is like 50 to 70% accurate. But that is enough for users, if you are planning ahead, if you're going to implant these in your brain, and like people like Elon Musk has been going on about this, you don't want your inner thought to leak out, or your inner monologue to leak out, because you'll be, I don't know, if you're like me, you'll just be, every other word will be a four-letter word. So you want to have some control so that you only the computer that is plugging into your brain, it would only translate your thought into speech when you actually want that to be done.
Right.
So the researchers did they play around with two different ways. Both are quite effective. The first way is they basically train the decoder to decode attempted speech as normal, but whenever, for all the trials where the subjects are asked to just think about speaking, so just inner speech trial, the decoder, instead of producing the phonemes, it is trained to produce a silent token. So you can do that. You can just say, oh, these are not actual words. You just want to produce silence. And when you train the decoder like that, then the decoder is able to basically produce phonemes as normal when they're doing attempted speech, but just go to silence. So you kind of it's been learned to suppress the output whenever it's in a speech. And they don't go into how it's done, but you can think about maybe it is moving along this orthogonal planning stroke in a speech subspace that is 90 degrees to your word discrimination subspace. And so that is method number one. But maybe, well, engineering-wise, it's less cool, like scientifically less cool, but engineering-wise cooler is the second way that they're doing it, which is basically the equivalent of if you want to say the thing that you're thinking about, you just do the mental equivalent of saying, "Hey Siri." So they have a keyword.
Yeah, password, yeah.
A password that you would think about if you want the next sentence to be, or the next passage to be verbalized. And in the paper, the password they use is Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which is a musical that you would see plastered in London Underground for the advert. I think it's a very British thing. Maybe that's why it's a good password. No one normally thinks about it. But they can show that so this is basically a keyword that your brain-computer interface would look for, and it would not decode anything unless they see this keyword in front of it. And when they do it, they are able to basically suppress output.
The problem is that your mind is always wandering, right? So
right.
You could decode this, but then you say something and then you start wandering. So it's a little clumsy to have to turn it on and off, right?
That is true. I mean, actually, that's a very good point. And when I'm talking to you, a lot of the silence period, I'm actually going back and forth between saying what I'm thinking and thinking.
No, and it's very dynamic, so I'm not sure that a password is...
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
The first approach, which is, tuning the decoder, seems to me to make a little more sense. The problem is these are all originating in the same part of the brain, so that makes it harder, right?
Potentially, but if it's moving along different discriminable patterns that when you do PCA, it's going 90 degrees, maybe it is doable. But like you said, I completely agree. I think given how much thinking is required for every sentence, I think the keyword might be quite difficult.
Yeah, I'm always thinking of all kinds of things, and I don't want to say them, right?
Right. Yeah.
So that's what this whole mental privacy, they call it, which is an interesting phrase that, so we are now on the cusp of being able to have a conversation with someone who can't speak physically. It's great, but they have to have mental privacy. You can't just pull everything out of their brain. And this is really, besides the technical aspects, this is really important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's wonderful that the researchers are thinking ahead to make this tech go from just the lab to actually in patients and usable. And these are some of the things that, I mean, if you tell me, I wouldn't even think about. If you tell me about like turning Stephen Hawking into the Stephen Hawking, just think, and then it would verbalize things. But
So you can imagine that it could be made into a vocalizer, right? You could have a physical thing that would take the decoded waves as words and then speak them, have it spoken. So you could have a little speaker on you and it would just vocalize them. So it wouldn't have to be on a computer screen either, kind of like what Hawking did, right?
Right. I mean, that's what they did in this paper. They actually turns into a vocalizer. Yeah. But not just that, like in the future, like each phoneme, well, you would think each phoneme, when we say things, we don't just pronounce the words. A lot of the words are behind it have emotion and like volume control. Like all these things might also be decodable in the future. So there's to translate thought into words. I think there's quite a lot more we can work on.
Here's the crux of the problem. You're having a conversation and someone says something and then you say something and then you're thinking, this guy's a jerk. Why is he asking me this crap? And you don't want that to be coming out of your vocalizer, right?
Exactly. I don't know. Would the world be a better place if it comes out, or would a bird be? I think it would be I think it would just be punching each other all the time.
That's a good question. If we said what we thought, I'd like to know what RFK Jr. is really thinking instead of the lies that he spews out, right?
Exactly. I think sometimes sometimes people in position of power, full transparency might be, maybe in the future we would ask them to wear these brain hats to decode what
frankly, the world operates in a huge deception. People lie to each other all the time. Power is all about deception, right? China, US, Russia, it's all about deception.
Yeah,
and if you
brinkmanship.
couldn't do that, that would be interesting, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But the animals deceive each other as well because they have to do that to catch each other and eat them, so it's the way of the world.
But even things like, you can say things like camouflage and like mimic, that is like, you don't even plan, like, it's just pure evolution. The brain isn't required for things like that. It's just what comes out of evolution.
But that's a good point. Maybe we would find ways around this, 'cause even if it's extracting our brain waves and decoding it, maybe we would find ways to game the system. Who knows, right?
Right. Yeah.
People would develop little implants that could short circuit it and do this and that. Humans are very imaginative.
No, I think the ability to not say what we're really thinking is critical for society and civilization. I think there will be mayhem if this thing isn't.
Our brain is really a haven. You can hide a lot in there, right?
Yeah.
And up till now, nobody could get it out. That's the whole thing.
But
right?
on the other side, if you listen to people who do things like meditate and like be able to understand what you really are, like in going back to the Greek oracles, like what is some of the things, the tagline on the Greek oracle is that you should know yourself, because it is a hard thing to do. So maybe with one of these decoders, it would do the work of meditation for you. I don't know, but it sounds like a bit of a shortcut. Who knows?
This paper is really interesting because there's the one aspect which is to help people communicate, right? And the neuroscience behind that and the computational biology. But then there's the sociological aspect, right? How much of your mind do you want to expose? And because no matter what checks you put in place, people will get around them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And it's like, you carry a credit card with a chip and people can read it. One day they're going to be able to read your mind.
Yeah, and I think this will be a persistent problem with brain-computer interface, which is not, as Vivian said, it's not just ALS, but like people with stroke, people maybe with some other disability, like they really need help with, or like quadriplegic people, like we talked about before, using your brain waves to control your limbs like a robot in the Gregoire Coutine's lab. So things like that, I think we'll have to, as technology improves, we really have to think about it. Yeah. Before mayhem breaks out in society. Yeah.
It's so fascinating. I'm thinking of all kinds of scenarios. Like, in this investigation, the investigators are asking a question and then the person goes, why don't you leave me alone? Go F yourself, something like that, which they can't control, but that's what they feel. And then it reads out. That's so amazing, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you, Tim. That was great. I love it. I really like this. I don't understand all the science, but I get what they're trying to do and what the limitations are.
I hope the listeners at least got a sense of swiveling your chair around in 3D space to align things to a plane, a lower dimension, and kind of that as a way of dimension, simplifying thought.
All right, that's TWiN 68. You can find the show notes at microbe.tv/TWiN. If you have any questions or comments, you can send them to twin@microbe.tv. And if you enjoy these programs, we'd love your support to continue them. Microbe.tv/contribute. Vivian Morrison, who has left already, is in New Orleans. We thank Vivian. Tim Chung is at New York University. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Vincent. A lot of maths, kind of quasi-maths. Sorry about that. But I got it out of my system, so.
It's good. I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at microbe.tv. You've been listening to This Week in Neuroscience. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next month.